She never went anywhere without her phone. That's what everyone said afterward. Jermain Charlo was the kind of person who posted everything. Photos of her boys, sunset views from the Flathead Reservation, funny moments with friends. Her social media was a running diary of her life, updated constantly, compulsively almost. So when the messages went unanswered on Saturday morning, June 16, 2018, her grandmother knew. The phone rang. And rang. Straight to voicemail. Facebook messages sat unread. The little circle that showed she was active, gone. Her grandmother Vicky called her daughter Valinda. Have you heard from Jermain? No. They kept calling. Kept texting. The silence grew heavier with each unanswered attempt. This wasn't like her. Jermain was 23 years old, a mother of 2 young boys, and she'd been in Missoula the night before. About 40 miles from home. Just a night out. She was supposed to come back. But she didn't. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. By Sunday, the family was frantic. They called hospitals, called the tribal police on the Flathead Reservation, called anyone who might have seen her. The Missoula Police Department told them they'd need to file the report in person, not over the phone. So on Wednesday, June 20th, 4 days after Jermain was last seen, her Aunt Valinda made the drive to Missoula and walked into the police station to file an official missing person report. For days of silence. For days of her phone staying dark. For days of those 2 little boys asking where their mother was. The police did their due diligence, Valinda would later say. Check the hospitals. Check the shelters. Then they told the family that Jermain wasn't in any immediate danger. That she was an adult. That sometimes people just leave. But her family knew better. Jermain would never just leave. Not her boys. Thomas was 4. Jake was 2. Her whole world revolved around them. She'd take them fishing on the river, teach them about the outdoors, try to give them the best life she knew how. And then there was the letter. Months later, when the searches had begun and the billboards were going up along Highway 93, Jermain's grandmother Vicky wrote a message. A public plea, really. But it read like a letter to her granddaughter, wherever she might be. Dear Jermain, if you're anywhere at all that you can read this, please know I love you. So many people love you. We pray you'll feel this love, and it will strengthen you to survive whatever it is you're dealing with, or whoever has you. We know you would not just walk away from your family, and especially not your sons, Thomas and Jake. They need you now more than ever. Please, know we are not giving up. So many are doing so much. Do not lose faith. God gives his strongest battles to his toughest soldiers. All my love, forever and ever, your Yia. The letter appeared on a GoFundMe page set up to raise money for billboards, for searches, for any tool that might bring Jermain home. Because by then, the family understood what they were up against. This wasn't just a missing person case. This was about being invisible. Jermain Charlo was a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. She lived on the Flathead Reservation in western Montana, a place of stunning natural beauty, mountains and forests and rivers that stretched for miles. But it was also a place where Indigenous women disappeared at rates that made the statistics almost unbearable to read. In Montana, Indigenous people make up only about 6% of the population, but they account for 24% of the state's active missing persons cases. Jermain's Aunt Valinda would later put it plainly. MMIW isn't something that just started. It's happened since colonization, and we've all been kept so quiet about it. MMIW. Missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's a crisis that has haunted Native communities for generations. And in 2018, when Jermain vanished, the nation was just beginning to wake up to its scope. Over 5,700 Indigenous women and girls were reported missing in 2016 alone. More than 80% of Indigenous women experience violence in their lifetime. These aren't just numbers. They're daughters, mothers, sisters, aunts. They're people like Jermain. But to understand what happened to her, what might have happened, you have to understand who she was before that night. Before the alley. Before the surveillance footage that would become the last confirmed image of her alive. Jermain Austin Charlo was born on April 18, 1995, on the Flathead Reservation. She grew up surrounded by family, a close-knit, supportive network of aunts, cousins, grandparents. Her roots ran deep. She was a descendant of Chief Charlo, the leader who led a peaceful resistance in the 1870s, refusing to leave tribal lands even when the U.S. government demanded it. That strength, that stubbornness, seemed to run in her blood. People who knew Jermain described her as creative, independent, outdoorsy. She loved nature, loved animals. At various points, she had a flying squirrel, 2 pigs, and a whole menagerie of pets that made her family laugh. She was goofy, spontaneous, quick to smile. The kind of person who posted everything online because she wanted to share the joy. She was also an artist. She dreamed of attending the Institute of American Indian Arts, of turning her creativity into something bigger. She started a YouTube channel. She poured herself into her work. And above all, she was a mother. Thomas and Jake were her everything. She wanted to teach them about fishing, about hiking, about the land their ancestors had fought to protect. She wanted to give them stability, a good life, the kind of family she'd always dreamed of. But building that family had been harder than she'd imagined. Because there was Michael Difference. They met when they were teenagers. The Difference family had moved in across the street from Jermain's family sometime in the late 2000s. Michael was about 2 years older, 16 to Jermain's 14 when they started dating. At first, it seemed harmless. Puppy love. They were inseparable. They'd spend their days fishing on the river, taking long walks, just being kids. But somewhere along the way, things changed. April 13, 2013. Jermain was 17 years old, just weeks away from turning 18. She and Michael were living together by then, sharing a life, making plans. That night, they got into an argument. According to the police report, Michael held Jermain down across the hood of his van. He hit her 4 times in the face and head, threw her to the ground, spit on her. When he was arrested and convicted for partner or family member assault, the court learned something else. This was Michael Difference's second domestic violence conviction. The first one was sealed because he'd been a minor when it happened. But the consequences were starting to stack up. He was ordered to pay a fine, spend a day in jail, forfeit his firearms for a year, and complete 40 hours of domestic violence treatment. His right to possess guns was permanently revoked. Jermain pressed charges. She testified. She followed through. And then she stayed with him. It's a pattern that anyone familiar with domestic violence will recognize. The cycle of abuse, the apologies, the promises to change. The hope that maybe this time will be different. That the person you fell in love with will come back. Jermain wanted that picture-perfect family. She wanted her boys to have a father. So even after the conviction, even after the violence, she and Michael remained together. They moved into a camper on his parents' property. They had 2 sons, Thomas, born in 2014, and Jake, born in 2016. Michael worked as a seasonal firefighter. Jermain pursued her creative dreams, worked odd jobs, tried to make it work. But the control never loosened. Friends and family would later describe Michael as intensely jealous. If Jermain talked to other men, he'd get angry. If she tried to do anything independently, he'd shut it down. "If I can't have you, nobody else can," one family member recalled him saying. It was textbook domestic violence. The isolation, the jealousy, the sense that she belonged to him. By 2017, Jermain had had enough. She broke up with Michael for good, or so she thought. On July 29, 2017, she called the police. She told them that she'd let Michael stay with her temporarily, but when he got handsy, she asked him to leave. He left, but he took their 2 sons with him. Because there was no formal custody agreement in place, the police couldn't do anything. That fall, Jermain and Michael went to tribal court to settle custody. Michael was given residential custody. The boys would live with him. Jermain would have them Monday through Wednesday and every other weekend. She was also ordered to pay $800 a month in child support. $800. For a young woman working at a cantina in Dixon, Montana, that was an enormous amount. Almost impossibly high. And she didn't have legal representation at the hearing. The arrangement was lopsided. Painful. But Jermain did what she had to do. She paid the support. She showed up for her visitation. She stayed in her sons' lives. A couple of weeks after the custody hearing, her aunt and her grandmother noticed bruises on Jermain's face and arms. When they asked her about it, she said she tripped while getting her kids out of the bathtub. They didn't believe her. But Jermain was an adult. And she was trying, in her own way, to navigate a situation that had no good answers. She needed to see her boys. And Michael was the gatekeeper. So she stayed civil. Stayed in contact. tried to manage the relationship carefully. By the spring of 2018, though, something had shifted. Jermain had started dating someone new. His name was Jacob. He lived in Missoula, and Jermain had been visiting him regularly. It was a new relationship, fresh, hopeful. Jacob was out of the state the weekend of June 15th, but he'd told Jermain she could stay at his apartment while he was gone. She hadn't told Michael about Jacob. That omission would matter. On the day before she disappeared, Friday, June 15th, Jermain told Jacob that Michael had been yelling at her, asking if she was dating anyone, saying he wanted to get back together. Michael's mother would later tell police the same thing. Michael was still in love with Jermain. He wanted her back. But Jermain had moved on. That Friday night, she made plans to go out in Missoula. It wasn't unusual. She went to the city often to see Jacob, to get away from the reservation, to have a little freedom. She visited multiple bars that night. The Dark Horse, the Golden Rose, the Badlander, and she wasn't alone. Michael Difference was with her. Exactly why they were together that night remains unclear. Whether she agreed to meet him, whether it was coincidence, whether he'd followed her, no one knows for sure. But surveillance cameras captured them together in the alley behind the Badlander bar. In the footage, Jermain is seen talking to a couple of guys she knew. Friends. Casual conversation. Michael stands behind her, arms crossed, not saying much. One of the men, Nick Rolt, would later tell investigators that Michael wasn't very happy about Jermain talking to other people. His friend Eddie Woodcock agreed. When she started talking to us, I just remember him like, had his arms crossed or whatever. And then, he didn't really say anything that entire time. Michael wasn't stoked, Woodcock said. A bartender working that night would later tell investigators that Jermain seemed disinterested in Michael, that she was trying to distance herself. But the footage shows what happened next. Just before midnight, Jermain and Michael walked away together. Down the alley. Eastbound. Away from the bar. Away from the people. Away from the cameras. And then they disappeared from view. That grainy surveillance footage, a few seconds of Jermain walking, Michael a few paces behind her, would become the last confirmed sighting of Jermain Charlo. It's 11:58 p.m. on June 15th, 2018. She's wearing casual clothes. Her hair is down. She looks relaxed, normal. Just a 23-year-old woman walking down an alley on a Friday night. But she would never be seen again. What happened in the next few hours, between midnight and sunrise, is a mystery built on contradictions, discrepancies, and silences that have never been adequately explained. But before we get there, we need to understand the geography, the alley, the streets, the distances. Because in a case like this, every block matters. The Badlander is located in downtown Missoula. The alley behind it is narrow, dimly lit, the kind of place where people duck out for a smoke or a private conversation. It's not inherently dangerous, just ordinary. Urban. The kind of space that exists in every city. From that alley, if you walk east, you'll eventually reach the neighborhood where Jacob lived. It's not far. A few blocks. Walkable. About 5 minutes from the alley, there's a grocery store called the Orange Street Food Farm. Open late. A landmark. The kind of place you'd use as a meeting point or a drop-off spot. Michael Difference would later tell Jermain's family that he dropped her off near that grocery store around 1 a.m. He said she was planning to meet a friend named Cassidy. But when he talked to police, his story changed. He said he dropped her off 8 blocks away. In a different neighborhood entirely. 8 blocks. That's not a small discrepancy. That's a fundamentally different location. Detectives noted the inconsistency. They found it interesting. They also couldn't find anyone in Jermain's life named Cassidy. Because there was no Cassidy, Jermain had planned to stay at Jacob's apartment. But she apparently didn't want to tell Michael that. So she'd made up a name. A cover story. Jacob, who was out of state that weekend, tried calling Jermain shortly before 1 a.m. The phone rang. Several times. And then it went to voicemail. Jacob told police it seemed like someone had deliberately ended the call. That call, the one that rang and then stopped, happened around the same time Michael claimed he was dropping Jermain off in downtown Missoula. But something else was happening at that exact moment. Something that would later become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. Jermain's phone was moving. Cell phone data doesn't lie. It's not perfect. Towers can ping from miles away. Signals can bounce unpredictably, but it leaves a trail. A digital breadcrumb of where a phone has been, even if the person carrying it is trying to stay hidden. And on the night Jermain Charlo disappeared, both her phone and Michael Difference's phone left a trail. Around 2:07 a.m. on June 16, 2018, about an hour after Michael claimed he'd dropped Jermain off in downtown Missoula, both phones pinged off the same cell tower. That tower was located near the Difference family home in Paradise, Montana. Paradise is a small, unincorporated community about 90 miles northwest of Missoula. It sits along Highway 200, just over the Idaho border. Rural. Remote. The kind of place where houses are spread out, where neighbors aren't close, where privacy is easy to come by. Michael's parents lived there. He'd been staying with them. The cell tower ping placed both phones in that area around 2 a.m., which means one of two things. Either Jermain went willingly with Michael to Paradise that night, or her phone did. Michael Difference never mentioned driving to Paradise that night. Not to Jermain's family. Not in his initial statements to police. He said he dropped her off in Missoula. He said he went home. But the phone data told a different story. When detectives confronted him with the cell tower evidence, Michael changed his story again. He admitted that yes, he had driven to Paradise that night. But he said Jermain wasn't with him. He said he'd driven home alone. He said her phone must have pinged off that tower because it was still in his vehicle somehow. Maybe she'd left it behind. Maybe it had fallen between the seats. Except Jermain's phone was never found. Not in Michael's truck. Not in his parents' home. Not anywhere. If she'd left it behind accidentally, why didn't he return it to her family? Why didn't he mention it when they started calling him, frantic, asking if he'd seen her? The phone went dark sometime early that Saturday morning. The last ping was around 2 a.m. After that, nothing. No calls. No texts. No social media activity. Jermain's digital life, which had been so vibrant and constant, just stopped. By Monday, when her family was still desperately trying to reach her, they started calling Michael. He was the last person who'd been with her. He had to know something. But Michael didn't answer. His phone went straight to voicemail. Again and again. Jermain's Aunt Valinda tried reaching out to Michael's family. His mother answered. She said Michael was up north, working a fire. Unreachable. She didn't know when he'd be back. That conversation would later strike investigators as strange. Michael's mother seemed to already know that Jermain was missing, even though the family hadn't told her yet. How did she know? When Michael finally did talk to police, weeks later, he was cooperative. Calm. He answered their questions. He agreed to let them search his truck. They didn't find anything. No blood. No signs of a struggle. No physical evidence that anything violent had happened. But they did find inconsistencies. Michael told investigators that when he dropped Jermain off that night, she'd taken her backpack with her. It was a small detail, but it mattered. If she'd taken her belongings, it suggested she was planning to go somewhere. To stay at Jacob's apartment, maybe. To continue her night. But her backpack was never found either. Neither was her jacket. Or her phone. Or any trace of her. Michael also told police that Jermain had been drinking that night. That she was intoxicated. That she'd wanted to keep partying. But he was tired and wanted to go home. The bartenders and witnesses from the bars told a different story. They said Jermain seemed sober. Coherent. Normal. One witness said she seemed like she was trying to get away from Michael. Another said Michael seemed jealous. But no one saw what happened after they left the alley. The Missoula Police Department interviewed dozens of people. They canvassed the bars. They pulled surveillance footage from every camera they could find in the downtown area. They tracked Jermain's movements throughout the night. Dark Horse Tavern. Golden Rose Saloon. The Badlander. And then, nothing. No footage of her getting into a car. No footage of her walking down the street. No witnesses who saw her after midnight. The last image was that alley. Her walking away. Michael following. Detectives asked Michael to take a polygraph test. He refused. That refusal is not evidence of guilt. People refuse polygraphs for all kinds of reasons, and the tests themselves are notoriously unreliable. But it added to the growing sense among Jermain's family that Michael was hiding something. Because everything about his behavior after that night felt wrong. He didn't help search for her. He didn't reach out to her family. He didn't post on social media asking people to look for her. He just went silent. And in that silence, Jermain's family had to become their own detectives. Valinda took the lead. She filed the missing person report. She coordinated with the Missoula Police Department and the Lake County Sheriff's Office. She contacted the FBI. Because this wasn't just a local matter anymore. When a Native American woman goes missing, jurisdiction becomes complicated. The Flathead Reservation has its own tribal police force. But Jermain disappeared in Missoula, which is off-reservation. That meant the Missoula Police Department had primary jurisdiction. But because Jermain was an enrolled member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, the FBI could also get involved under the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Initiative. It should have been all hands on deck. Instead, it felt like a bureaucratic tangle. Valinda described it as constantly hitting walls. She'd call one agency, and they'd tell her to call another. She'd ask for updates, and they'd tell her the case was active, but they couldn't share details. She understood, to a point. Investigations require confidentiality. But the lack of communication was excruciating. Meanwhile, the family organized their own searches. In the summer of 2018, they combed through fields and forests around Missoula. They walked riverbanks. They checked abandoned buildings. They put up flyers at every gas station, grocery store, and community center within 100 miles. Volunteers from the community joined them. Fellow tribal members, friends, strangers who'd heard Jermain's story and wanted to help. They searched for weeks, months. They found nothing. No clothing. No belongings. No trace of Jermain. It was as if she'd vanished into the air. But the family refused to believe she'd left willingly. They knew her too well. They knew the kind of mother she was. The kind of daughter. The kind of person who posted updates constantly because she wanted to share her life with the people she loved. She wouldn't just disappear. Someone had to know something. And slowly, as the case gained attention, tips started coming in. A woman called the police saying she'd seen someone who looked like Jermain at a gas station in Idaho. Detectives followed up. It wasn't her. Another caller said they'd seen her in Spokane, Washington. Again, investigators checked. Nothing. There were rumors, whispers, stories that circulated on social media and in the community. Some people said Jermain had been involved with drugs. That maybe she'd gotten into something dangerous. That maybe she owed the wrong people money. Her family pushed back hard against those rumors. Jermain wasn't perfect. No one is. But she wasn't living some secret, dangerous life. She was a young mother trying to make ends meet, trying to co-parent with a difficult ex, trying to build a future. And the rumors, Valinda said, were just another way of blaming the victim, of suggesting that somehow, Jermain was responsible for her own disappearance. It's a pattern that plays out again and again in cases involving Indigenous women. The victim gets scrutinized. Her past relationships. Her struggles. Her mistakes. Meanwhile, the person who was last seen with her, who changed his story, who refused a polygraph, whose phone data didn't match his account, faced no charges. Because there was no body. No physical evidence of a crime. Just a missing woman. And a man with inconsistent answers. In the months that followed, Jermain's family did everything they could to keep her case in the public eye. They worked with local advocacy groups. They connected with other families of missing Indigenous women. They held vigils. On what would have been Jermain's 24th birthday, April 18, 2019, her family gathered on the Flathead Reservation to release balloons in her honor. Thomas and Jake were there, holding balloons, too young to fully understand why their mother wasn't. The case was featured on local news, then regional news. Then national outlets started picking it up. In 2019, a writer named Erica Peterson published a long-form investigative piece about Jermain's disappearance. The article laid out the timeline, the discrepancies in Michael's story, the cell phone evidence. It asked the question that everyone was thinking: why hasn't anyone been charged? The Missoula Police Department responded carefully. They said the investigation was ongoing. They said they were following every lead. They said they couldn't comment on specific suspects or persons of interest. But they also acknowledged the obvious. Without a body, without physical evidence, building a case was nearly impossible. Montana law does allow for murder charges without a body. It's called a no-body homicide prosecution. But it's rare. And it requires an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence. Did they have that here? The family thought so. Advocacy groups thought so. But the prosecutors, apparently, didn't. And so the case remained open. Active. Unsolved. Michael Difference was never named as a suspect. He was never arrested. He was never charged. Legally, he's an innocent man. But in the court of public opinion, the questions lingered. Why did his story change? Why did the cell phone data contradict his account? Why did he refuse the polygraph? Why didn't he help search for the mother of his children? In 2020, A Reddit user posted a detailed write-up of Jermain's case in the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. It quickly gained traction. Thousands of comments. People from all over the world weighing in, offering theories, expressing outrage. Some commenters pointed out that Michael had a documented history of violence against Jermain, that he'd been convicted of domestic assault, that he was controlling and jealous. Others noted the eerie similarities between Jermain's case and other cases of missing Indigenous women whose ex-partners were the last to see them alive. But there were also people who cautioned against jumping to conclusions, who said that without evidence, accusing someone of murder was dangerous, that the internet had a history of getting things wrong. And that's the tension that hangs over this case. Everyone has a theory. Everyone has a gut feeling. But gut feelings don't hold up in court. The Missoula Police Department continues to maintain that the investigation is active. They've said they believe Jermain is the victim of a homicide. They've said they have persons of interest. But they won't say who. And they won't say why charges haven't been filed. In 2021, 3 years after Jermain disappeared, her family held another vigil. This time, it was bigger, more organized, tied into a broader movement. May 5th is now recognized as the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. In Montana, the state legislature passed Hannah's Act, named after Hannah Harris, another missing Indigenous woman, which created a task force to address the crisis. Jermain's case became a rallying point, a symbol of the systemic failures that allow Indigenous women to vanish without adequate investigation or media attention. But for her family, it was never about symbolism. It was about finding Jermain. It was about bringing her home. Valinda continued to coordinate searches. She reached out to private investigators. She contacted psychics, cadaver dog handlers, anyone who might be able to help. In the fall of 2021, a team of volunteer searchers focused their efforts on areas around Paradise, Montana, near where the cell phones had pinged that night. They searched fields, forests, old logging roads. They didn't find her. In 2022, the family raised money to put up billboards along Highway 93, the main road connecting Missoula to the Flathead Reservation. The billboards featured Jermain's photo and a phone number for tips. Missing since June 16, 2018, the signs read, "If you have any information, please call." The calls that came in were well-intentioned, but ultimately unhelpful. More mistaken sightings. More theories. No concrete leads. And through it all, Thomas and Jake were growing up. 4 years old and 2 years old when their mother disappeared. Now, they're 10 and 8. They don't remember her the way her family does. They have photos, videos, stories that relatives tell them, but they don't have their mother. Michael Difference, for his part, has remained largely silent. He hasn't given interviews. He hasn't made public statements. According to court records, he retained custody of the boys. He's moved on with his life. Jermain's family hasn't been able to. In late 2023, Valinda spoke at a community event about missing Indigenous persons. She talked about the toll the last 5 years had taken. The sleepless nights. The constant wondering. The guilt that comes with not being able to bring Jermain home. But she also talked about hope. Not the naive kind. Not the kind that says everything will be okay. The kind that says, we will not stop looking. Because the thing about hope in a case like this is that it's not about believing in a happy ending. It's about refusing to let someone be forgotten. Jermain Charlo's case is still listed as active and open with the Missoula Police Department. Her NamUs profile, National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, remains online. Case number MP 51201. The FBI continues to be involved. But as the years pass, the likelihood of finding answers diminishes. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. Evidence degrades. And yet, the family persists. They've built a network of support with other families of missing Indigenous women. They share resources, strategies, emotional support. They've learned that they're not alone in this nightmare. That there are dozens, hundreds, of families going through the same thing. Women who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Ex-partners with violent histories. Investigations that stalled. Prosecutors who said there wasn't enough evidence. It's a pattern. A horrifying, repeating pattern. And Jermain's case sits right in the middle of it. But here's what makes her case different from some of the others. There's evidence. There's surveillance footage. There's cell phone data. There's a documented history of domestic violence. There are inconsistent statements. There's enough, many people believe, to at least bring charges. So why hasn't it happened? That's the question that haunts everyone who follows this case. Is it a matter of waiting for more evidence? Is it a matter of building an airtight case before going to trial? Or is it something else? Is it because Jermain is Indigenous? Because cases involving Native women don't get the same urgency, the same resources, the same pressure? Her family believes it's both. They believe the system failed Jermain before she disappeared, when she was assaulted and the consequences for her abuser were minimal. And they believe the system failed her after, when her case didn't get the immediate, aggressive investigation it deserved. But they also believe that someone, somewhere, knows what happened that night. And they're holding out hope that one day, that person will come forward. Because the silence around Jermain's disappearance isn't just Michael's silence. It's a broader silence. The silence of a community that maybe heard something but didn't want to get involved. The silence of a system that didn't treat her case with the urgency it deserved. The silence of a society that still, even now, doesn't fully grasp the scope of the crisis facing Indigenous women. But her family refuses to be silent. Every year on June 16th, they hold a vigil. Every year, they renew their call for information. Every year, they remind the world that Jermain Charlo mattered. That she wasn't just a statistic. That she was a mother, a daughter, a granddaughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams and flaws and a future that was stolen from her. And they will not let her be forgotten. There's a photograph of Jermain that her family uses in most of the missing person posters. In it, she's looking directly at the camera. Her expression is soft, but direct. There's a slight smile, not big, not forced. Just present. Her dark hair frames her face. Her eyes are clear. It's the kind of photo that makes you feel like you know her. Like if you passed her on the street, you'd recognize her immediately. That's intentional. When someone goes missing, the photo matters. It's not just about identification, it's about connection. About making the public care. About transforming a missing person report from a file number into a human being. But there's a cruel irony in that. Because for Jermain to get attention, for her case to break through the noise, her family had to work harder than most. They had to organize their own searches while also navigating a bureaucratic system that seemed designed to exhaust them. They had to become media savvy, learning how to pitch her story to journalists, how to use social media effectively, how to keep her name in circulation. They had to fight against stereotypes. The assumption that missing Indigenous women were somehow involved in risky behavior, that they chose their circumstances, that their disappearances were less urgent than others. And they had to do all of this while grieving, while living in a state of unresolved trauma, while watching Jermain's sons grow up without their mother. Valinda would later describe the experience as being in a constant state of fight or flight. Every day, she woke up thinking, what can I do today to bring Jermain home? Some days, that meant calling the police for updates. Some days, it meant organizing search parties. Some days, it meant sitting at a computer for hours, responding to messages from strangers who claimed they'd seen Jermain, even though most of the tips led nowhere. And some days, it meant simply surviving the weight of not knowing. Because that's the thing about missing person cases that people don't always understand. There's no closure. There's no funeral. There's no moment where you can say goodbye and begin to heal. There's just waiting, hoping, and the slow, corrosive realization that every day that passes makes it less likely you'll ever get answers. By 2019, a year after Jermain disappeared, her case had become part of a larger conversation happening across the country. The MMIW movement, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, was gaining momentum. Activists, advocates, and family members were demanding change. They were calling out the systemic failures that allowed Indigenous women to disappear without adequate investigation. They were pushing for legislative reforms, for better coordination between tribal and federal law enforcement, for more funding and resources. And they were naming names. Not just the names of the missing women, though that was crucial, but also the names of the agencies, the officials, the systems that had failed them. In Montana, the statistics were impossible to ignore. According to the Urban Indian Health Institute's 2018 report, Montana had 26 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, one of the highest rates in the country relative to population size. And those were just the documented cases. Many advocates believe the real number was much higher, that cases went unreported or were misclassified or simply fell through the cracks because no one was paying attention. Jermain's case became emblematic of this crisis. Here was a young woman with a documented history of domestic violence. A woman whose ex-partner had been convicted of assaulting her. A woman who was last seen with that same man, who then gave conflicting stories about where he'd dropped her off. And yet, no arrest. No charges. No resolution. It wasn't that the police weren't investigating. By all accounts, they were. They'd interviewed witnesses. They'd pulled phone records. They'd conducted searches. But something wasn't adding up. Or maybe something was adding up, but not enough to convince a prosecutor to file charges. Because here's the hard truth about cases like this. Without a body, without physical evidence, building a case is extraordinarily difficult. Even with circumstantial evidence, the changing stories, the cell phone pings, the history of violence, a prosecutor has to believe they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime occurred and that the defendant committed it. And beyond a reasonable doubt is a high bar. Defense attorneys are skilled at creating doubt, at poking holes in timelines, at offering alternative explanations. What if Jermain did get out of the truck that night, and something happened after Michael left? What if she was picked up by someone else? What if the cell phone data is misleading? Towers can ping from miles away, after all. What if she did leave voluntarily and is out there somewhere, alive, just choosing not to come back? These are the kinds of questions a defense attorney would raise. And without physical evidence, without a body, without a crime scene, without DNA, it becomes a battle of narratives. His word against what? Against the absence of Jermain. Against the fact that a young mother who posted constantly on social media, who was deeply connected to her family, who loved her sons more than anything, suddenly went completely silent. Against the fact that her phone stopped working at the exact time it was pinging near the home of the man who was last seen with her. Against the fact that he changed his story. Against the fact that he refused a polygraph. It should be enough. The family believes it's enough. Advocates believe it's enough. But apparently, it's not. So the case remains open. And Michael Difference remains free. In the years since Jermain disappeared, there have been some developments. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Justice launched Operation Lady Justice, a federal task force specifically focused on missing and murdered Indigenous women. The goal was to improve coordination between federal, state, tribal, and local law enforcement, to create databases that could track cases more effectively, to provide resources and support for families. It was a step in the right direction. But for families like Jermain's, it felt too late. The task force couldn't bring Jermain back. It couldn't change the fact that crucial time had been lost in the early days of the investigation. It couldn't undo the years of trauma her family had endured. Still, Valinda engaged with the initiative. She testified at hearings. She shared Jermain's story. She pushed for systemic change. Because even if it was too late for Jermain, maybe it wasn't too late for the next woman. Maybe the next family wouldn't have to fight as hard to be heard. Maybe the next case would be taken seriously from day one. That's the hope, anyway. But hope is complicated when you're living in the aftermath of a disappearance. In 2020, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes passed a resolution formally supporting the MMIW movement and calling for greater resources to address the crisis. The resolution honored Jermain by name. It recognized her as a beloved member of the tribal community. It acknowledged that her disappearance was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of violence against Indigenous women. And it committed the tribe to doing better, to supporting families, to demanding accountability, to refusing to let these women be forgotten. For Jermain's family, the resolution was bittersweet. It was validating to see her name recognized in such a formal way. But it was also a reminder that she was still gone. That recognition and resolutions, while important, didn't bring her home. Around the same time, a documentary filmmaker reached out to Valinda, asking if the family would be interested in participating in a film about Jermain's case. Valinda was hesitant at first. She'd done interviews with journalists. She'd spoken at events. She'd shared Jermain's story countless times. But a documentary felt different. More invasive, maybe. More permanent. But ultimately, she agreed. Because visibility matters. Because the more people who know Jermain's name, the more likely it is that someone, somewhere, will remember something. Will come forward. Will provide the piece of information that finally breaks the case open. The documentary was released in 2021. It was respectful, thorough, and heartbreaking. It featured interviews with Jermain's family, with investigators, with advocates working on MMIW issues. It laid out the timeline of that night. It examined the discrepancies in Michael's story. It asked hard questions about why the case remained unsolved. And it ended with a plea. If you know anything, please come forward. The documentary didn't solve the case, but it did generate new tips. People who'd been in Missoula that night reached out, sharing observations they hadn't thought were important before. A few of the tips were credible enough that investigators followed up, but none of them led to Jermain. Still, the family considers it a success. Because every time Jermain's story is shared, there's a chance. A chance that someone with information will feel compelled to speak. A chance that public pressure will force law enforcement to take another look. A chance that the case won't fade into obscurity. And obscurity is the real enemy in cases like this. Because when the public stops paying attention, when the media moves on, when the family is left to grieve alone, that's when cases go cold. That's when files get buried in cabinets. That's when the missing become forgotten. Jermain's family is determined not to let that happen. Every year, they mark June 16th. Not as the anniversary of her disappearance, though it is that, but as a day to remember her, to celebrate who she was, to renew their commitment to finding her. In 2022, on the 4th anniversary, they held a ceremony on the Flathead Reservation. Family members spoke. Community members spoke. Tribal elders offered prayers. Thomas and Jake were there, sitting quietly, holding photos of their mother. At 10 and 8 years old now, they were old enough to understand, at least partially, what had happened. Their mother was gone. No one knew where. But everyone promised they wouldn't stop looking. After the ceremony, Valinda posted on Facebook. The post was simple, direct. 4 years without answers. For years of pain. For years of fighting for justice. We will never stop. Jermain deserves to be found. Her boys deserve to know what happened to their mother. And whoever is responsible deserves to be held accountable. The post was shared hundreds of times. Comments poured in from people all over the world. Some were from other families of missing persons, offering solidarity and support. Some were from strangers who'd followed the case and wanted to let the family know they hadn't forgotten. And some were from people who simply couldn't fathom how this could still be unsolved. How? In a case with this much evidence, surveillance footage, cell phone records, a history of domestic violence, conflicting statements, no one had been charged. It's a question that doesn't have a satisfying answer. Because the reality is, the criminal justice system doesn't always work the way we want it to. Sometimes, cases that seem clear-cut from the outside are more complicated from the inside. Sometimes, prosecutors are risk-averse, unwilling to bring charges unless they're certain they can win. Sometimes, the evidence that seems damning to the public isn't enough to meet the legal standard for prosecution. And sometimes, though it's hard to admit, the system simply doesn't value certain victims the way it values others. Jermain was Indigenous. She was a young mother without a lot of resources. She had a complicated relationship history. In the eyes of some, that made her less credible, less sympathetic, less worthy of aggressive investigation. It's an ugly truth. But it's a truth that families of missing Indigenous women confront every day. The assumption that their loved ones were somehow asking for it. That they put themselves in dangerous situations. That their disappearances are less urgent, less important, than the disappearances of white women from middle-class families. This is what advocates mean when they talk about the missing white woman syndrome. It's not that white women don't deserve attention when they go missing. Of course they do. But the disparity in media coverage, in law enforcement response, in public outcry, is stark. When a white woman goes missing, it becomes national news. When an Indigenous woman goes missing, her family has to fight just to get a detective assigned to the case. Jermain's case did eventually get national attention, but only after years of her family advocating, organizing, and refusing to be ignored. And even then, it wasn't enough to bring her home. In 2023, 5 years after she disappeared, a cold case team from the FBI reviewed Jermain's file. They re-interviewed witnesses. They re-examined the evidence. They consulted with forensic experts to see if there was anything that had been missed. The review took months. And when it was complete, the conclusion was frustratingly familiar. The case remains open and active. There are persons of interest. But there is not enough evidence at this time to file charges. Valinda was devastated. She'd allowed herself to hope that the cold case review might lead to a breakthrough. That fresh eyes on the evidence might see something the original investigators had missed. But instead, It was the same answer they'd been hearing for 5 years. Not enough evidence. Still, she didn't give up. She couldn't. Because giving up would mean accepting that Jermain might never be found. That her sons might never know what happened to their mother. That whoever was responsible might never face justice. And that was unacceptable. So the family continued. They continued searching. They continued advocating. They continued sharing Jermain's story. And they continued living with the weight of not knowing. Because that's what this case is really about. Not just the mystery of what happened that night, but the unbearable weight of uncertainty. The way it seeps into every part of your life. The way it makes it impossible to move forward because you don't know if you're supposed to be grieving or hoping. The way it fractures families, as some members cope by staying busy and others cope by withdrawing. The way it changes you, fundamentally and irreversibly. Valinda has said that she'll never be the same person she was before Jermain disappeared. How could she be? She spent the last 6 years fighting a system that wasn't designed to help families like hers. She spent countless hours searching fields and forests, knowing that what she might find would destroy her, but also give her the closure she desperately needs. She's watched her niece's sons grow up without their mother, and she's had to find ways to talk to them about loss and uncertainty that no child should have to understand. And through it all, she's carried the knowledge that somewhere out there, someone knows what happened. Someone knows where Jermain is. Someone is carrying that secret, and they've chosen to stay silent. That silence, that active choice to withhold information, is its own kind of violence. Because it prolongs the suffering. It denies the family the chance to grieve properly. It denies Jermain the dignity of being found, of being laid to rest, of having her story told completely. And it allows whoever is responsible to continue living their life, unburdened by consequences. That's the part that keeps Valinda up at night. Not just the not knowing, but the injustice of it. There's a specific kind of helplessness that comes with loving someone who's missing. It's different from grief. Grief has a shape. It has stages. It has rituals, funerals, memorials, the slow process of learning to live with absence. But when someone is missing, you're suspended between hope and despair. You can't grieve fully because maybe they're still alive. You can't move forward because maybe tomorrow will be the day they're found. You exist in limbo. And that limbo becomes your new normal. For Jermain's family, the first year was the hardest. Every time the phone rang, their hearts would stop. Every time there was a knock at the door, they'd wonder if this was it. If this was the moment they'd been dreading and hoping for. But the calls were usually reporters, or well-meaning strangers, or people claiming to have seen Jermain somewhere, tips that always led nowhere. And the knocks were usually neighbors bringing food, or advocates checking in, or volunteers organizing another search. The second year was different. The initial surge of public attention had faded. The media had moved on to newer stories. The search volunteers had returned to their normal lives. The family was left with the reality that this might never be resolved, that they might spend the rest of their lives not knowing. And that realization, that shift from desperate hope to grim acceptance, was its own kind of death. But they couldn't fully accept it, because somewhere in the back of their minds, they still believed that someone would come forward. That conscience would win out over self-preservation. That whoever knew what happened that night would eventually crack under the weight of the secret. They'd seen it happen in other cases. Years later, someone comes forward. A witness who was too scared to speak up initially. A friend who'd been told something in confidence and finally couldn't live with staying silent. Even perpetrators themselves, unable to carry the burden anymore. So they waited. And while they waited, they tried to keep Jermain's memory alive in ways that felt meaningful. Valinda started a scholarship fund in Jermain's name for young Indigenous women pursuing creative careers. It was a small fund, funded mostly by donations from the community, but it meant something. Jermain had dreamed of attending the Institute of American Indian Arts. She'd never gotten the chance. But maybe, through the scholarship, another young woman would. It wasn't justice, but it was something. The family also worked to ensure that Thomas and Jake knew their mother. They gathered photos, videos, stories. They created scrapbooks. They talked about Jermain often, not just about her disappearance, but about who she was. Her laugh, her sense of humor, her love of animals, her creativity. They wanted the boys to know her as a person, not just as a tragedy. It was important to them that Jermain's story didn't begin and end with that night in Missoula. That she wasn't reduced to a missing person case. that she remained fully human in the memories of the people who loved her. But it was hard, because the boys had questions. Where's Mom? Is she coming back? Why can't the police find her? And the family didn't have good answers. They tried to be honest without being traumatizing. They tried to give the boys hope without giving them false promises. They tried to help them understand that sometimes, in life, things don't make sense. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes we don't get answers. And sometimes we have to find a way to keep living anyway. By 2024, 6 years after Jermain's disappearance, the case had reached a strange sort of equilibrium. It was still officially open, still technically active, but there were no new leads, no new searches planned, no new developments to report. The investigation had gone as far as it could go without new information. And new information wasn't coming. The Missoula Police Department maintains that they've done everything they can with the evidence available. They've interviewed everyone who was at the bars that night. They've analyzed the surveillance footage from every angle. They've traced the cell phone records. They've searched areas where Jermain might have been taken. They've consulted with experts in domestic violence, in missing persons cases, in homicide investigations. And their conclusion is that Jermain is likely deceased, that she was the victim of foul play. But they cannot prove who is responsible. Not to the standard required for criminal prosecution. Michael Difference has never been officially named as a suspect. The police have only said that he is a person of interest, which is a careful, legal distinction. A person of interest is someone the police want to talk to, someone whose behavior or statements raise questions. But it's not an accusation. It's not even close to a charge. And Michael has the same rights as anyone else. The right to remain silent, the right to refuse to answer questions, the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. From a legal standpoint, there's nothing wrong with the way he's handled this. From a moral standpoint, it's harder to justify. Because the mother of his children is missing, and he was the last person known to be with her. And his story changed multiple times. And the cell phone evidence contradicts what he said. And he refused to take a polygraph. And he hasn't publicly appealed for information about her whereabouts. And he hasn't participated in searches. And he hasn't shown any visible signs of concern about what happened to her. Legally, none of that is evidence of guilt. But it's also not the behavior of someone who's genuinely confused about what happened. It's the behavior of someone who knows exactly what happened and has decided that silence is the safest strategy. The family sees it. The public sees it. But the legal system cannot act on suspicion alone. And so, 6 years later, nothing has changed. Except that Jermain's sons are older. Except that her family has had to learn to live with permanent uncertainty. Except that another year has passed without answers. In indigenous communities across North America, Jermain's story is painfully familiar. There are hundreds, thousands, of families going through the same thing. Women who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Ex-partners or acquaintances who were the last to see them. Investigations that stalled. Cases that went cold. And families left to navigate the aftermath alone. The MMIW movement has brought visibility to this crisis. There are now dedicated task forces, legislative initiatives, awareness campaigns. May 5th is officially recognized as the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. People wear red dresses, a symbol of the missing and murdered, in solidarity. Marches are held. Vigils are organized. Names are read aloud. It's progress. But it's not enough. Because visibility doesn't bring people back. Awareness doesn't solve cases. And while the movement has succeeded in making people care, in making the public pay attention, it hasn't fundamentally changed the systems that allow these disappearances to happen. Indigenous women are still disproportionately victims of violence. Their cases still receive less media attention, less law enforcement resources, less public outcry than cases involving non-Indigenous women. The jurisdictional complexities between tribal, state, and federal law enforcement still create gaps where cases can fall through. And the underlying issues, poverty, historical trauma, systemic racism, still create the conditions where violence thrives. Jermain's case is both unique and utterly ordinary. Unique in the specifics, the surveillance footage, the cell phone pings, the particular constellation of evidence. But ordinary in the larger pattern. An Indigenous woman in a relationship with a violent partner. A system that didn't protect her when she was alive. A system that hasn't been able to find her now that she's gone. Valinda has said that one of the hardest parts of this experience has been learning how common it is. How many other families are going through the exact same thing? How many other women have disappeared under nearly identical circumstances? It's a strange kind of comfort, knowing you're not alone. But it's also devastating, because it means the problem is so much bigger than one case. It means even if Jermain's case is solved, even if her family gets justice, there will still be hundreds of other families waiting, searching, grieving. And that's why Valinda has become an advocate. She speaks at conferences about MMIW. She testifies before legislative committees. She mentors other families who are navigating the early stages of a disappearance. She shares what she's learned about dealing with law enforcement, about managing media attention, about keeping a case alive in the public consciousness, about surviving the psychological toll. It's not the role she wanted. She wanted to be an aunt, a supportive family member, someone who could help Jermain raise her boys. Instead, she's become a spokesperson for a crisis she never asked to be part of. But she does it anyway. Because if her pain can help someone else, if her experience can make the next family's journey even slightly less difficult, then maybe it means something. Maybe Jermain's story can be part of the change that's needed. In 2024, Valinda was invited to speak at a symposium on missing persons cases. The event was held in Washington, D.C., and included law enforcement officials, policymakers, advocates, and families of the missing. Valinda's presentation focused on the systemic barriers that Indigenous families face when trying to find their loved ones. She talked about the jurisdictional issues, the lack of coordination between agencies, the cultural insensitivity that sometimes characterizes interactions with law enforcement, the way that stereotypes about Indigenous women influence how seriously cases are taken. And she talked about Jermain, about who she was, about what happened, about the fact that 6 years later, there were still no answers. The room was silent when she finished. Afterward, several law enforcement officials approached her privately. They told her they were sorry for what her family had been through. They told her that her presentation had opened their eyes to issues they hadn't fully understood before. They promised to do better. Valinda appreciated their words. But she'd heard promises before. What she needed wasn't sympathy. It was action. It was resources dedicated to solving cases like Jermain's. It was prosecutors willing to take risks, to build cases even when the evidence wasn't perfect. It was a system that valued Indigenous lives the same way it valued everyone else's. And that kind of change doesn't happen through symposiums alone. It requires sustained political will. It requires funding. It requires structural reform. It requires people in positions of power to care enough to make it a priority. So far, that hasn't happened on a large enough scale. But Valinda keeps pushing. Because what else can she do? Giving up isn't an option. Not when Jermain is still out there somewhere. Not when her boys still deserve answers. Not when there's still a chance, however slim, that justice might be served. Back home on the Flathead Reservation, life continues. The seasons change. The rivers flow. The mountains stand watch. And Jermain's absence is felt in 1,000 small ways. The empty chair at family gatherings. The birthday that passes without her. The moments when Thomas or Jake do something that reminds everyone of her. A gesture, a laugh, a way of looking at the world. Jermain's grandmother Vicky, who wrote that letter years ago, still keeps a photo of Jermain on her mantle. In it, Jermain is young, smiling, full of life. It's a reminder of what was lost, but also of what can never be taken away. The memory of who she was, the love she gave, the impact she had on the people around her. Vicky is older now. The years of stress and grief have taken their toll. But she still holds out hope. Not the naive hope of the early days, but the stubborn, defiant hope that refuses to accept that Jermain's story ends in uncertainty. She still believes that one day, someone will talk. One day, the truth will come out. One day, they'll be able to bring Jermain home. And until that day comes, they'll keep her memory alive. They'll keep sharing her story. They'll keep demanding justice. Because that's what you do when you love someone. You don't give up. You don't let them be forgotten. You fight for them, even when the fight seems impossible, even when the system tells you to accept defeat, even when years pass and nothing changes. You fight. Because the alternative, accepting that someone you love is just gone, that their life didn't matter enough for the truth to be uncovered, is unbearable. And so the family fights on. 6 years and counting. 6 years of searching. 6 years of advocating. 6 years of living in limbo. 6 years of watching Jermain's sons grow up without their mother. 6 years of waiting for the phone call that might never come. But they haven't given up. And they won't. Not as long as there's a chance. Not as long as someone out there knows what happened. Not as long as Jermain's case remains unsolved. Because every unsolved case is an injustice. Every missing person deserves to be found. Every family deserves answers. And Jermain Charlo, daughter, mother, granddaughter, friend, deserves better than to be forgotten. She deserves to be remembered. She deserves to be found. She deserves justice. And her family will not rest until all three of those things happen. In the quiet moments, when the advocacy work is done and the searches have ended for the day, Valinda sometimes allows herself to imagine what it would be like to get the call. The one that changes everything. A detective's voice on the other end, calm but urgent. We found her. Or, someone came forward. Or, we're making an arrest. She doesn't know which version of that call she's hoping for anymore. Finding Jermain would bring closure, but it would also confirm what everyone already suspects, that she's been gone all along. That the worst-case scenario was the reality. An arrest would mean justice, accountability, someone finally being held responsible. But it wouldn't bring Jermain back. Nothing would bring her back. And that's the truth that lives underneath all the activism, all the searches, all the public advocacy. No matter what happens next, Jermain is gone. The best they can hope for now is answers. And even that might be too much to ask. Because the passage of time works against missing persons cases in brutal ways. Memories fade. Witnesses move away or die. Physical evidence degrades. People who might have talked in the early days become less willing as years pass. And the person or people responsible, they have time to distance themselves from the crime. To convince themselves that they're safe. That they got away with it. In many cold cases, it's only when that sense of security cracks, when a relationship falls apart, when guilt becomes unbearable, when someone else threatens to expose the truth, that people finally talk. But 6 years in, Michael Difference hasn't cracked. If he knows what happened to Jermain, he's kept that knowledge locked away. And the people around him, his family, his friends, anyone who might have information, have maintained the same silence. Either they don't know anything, or they've chosen not to speak. Both possibilities are frustrating in different ways. If they genuinely don't know, it means Michael kept whatever happened that night entirely to himself. That he's carried the burden alone, without confiding in anyone. It's possible. People have kept darker secrets for longer. But if they do know something, if they've heard whispers, noticed inconsistencies, pieced together what might have happened, and they've chosen to stay silent, that's complicity. That's an active choice to protect someone at the expense of Jermain's family, at the expense of her sons, at the expense of justice. And that's harder to forgive. The thing about small communities is that people talk. Rumors spread. Gossip circulates. Everyone knows everyone else's business. On the Flathead Reservation, people have theories about what happened to Jermain. Some believe Michael killed her in a fit of rage when she refused to get back together with him. Some think it was premeditated, that he planned it, that the night out was a setup. Some wonder if someone else was involved, if Michael had helped disposing of her body. And some, a small minority, still hold out hope that maybe Jermain is alive somewhere, that she ran away and started a new life. But that theory gets harder to believe with each passing year. Because Jermain's digital footprint didn't just slow down. It stopped. Completely. No social media activity. No financial transactions. No use of her identification. It's as if she ceased to exist the moment she walked down that alley. And that kind of disappearance, total, absolute, doesn't happen when someone chooses to leave. It happens when someone is taken, when someone is hidden, when someone is silenced. The family knows this. They've known it from the beginning. But there's a difference between knowing something in your gut and having it confirmed. And without confirmation, they're stuck in this terrible in-between space. Unable to grieve. Unable to move on. Unable to do anything except wait. In late 2024, there was a brief flicker of hope. A woman in Idaho contacted the tip line, saying she thought she'd seen something relevant to Jermain's case. She'd been driving along a rural road near the Montana-Idaho border years ago and had noticed a man acting strangely near a wooded area. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, but after seeing a documentary about Jermain, something clicked. The location was in the general area where the cell phone pings had placed both phones that night. Investigators followed up. They searched the area the woman had described. They brought in cadaver dogs. They used ground-penetrating radar. They spent weeks combing through the woods. They found nothing. The woman's tip, while well-intentioned, didn't lead anywhere. But it reminded the family of something important. People are still paying attention. 6 years later, Jermain's case hasn't been forgotten. There are still people out there who think about her, who watch for signs, who want to help. And that matters. Because cold cases are often solved by persistence. By someone refusing to let the case die. By new technology becoming available, better DNA testing, improved forensic techniques, databases that can cross-reference information in ways that weren't possible before. By cultural shifts that make people more willing to come forward. By younger generations asking questions about family secrets. It happens. Not often enough. But it happens. And until it does, the family has to find ways to keep living. For Valinda, that means channeling her energy into advocacy work. For Vicky, it means prayer and faith that somehow, someday, the truth will emerge. For Jermain's other family members, it means trying to balance grief with the practical demands of daily life. And for Thomas and Jake, it means growing up in the shadow of their mother's disappearance. They're at an age now where they're starting to really understand. Where they can look up their mother's name online and find news articles, forum discussions, YouTube videos about her case. Where they can see the speculation, the theories, the accusations. Where they have to grapple with the fact that their mother's disappearance is public property, that strangers have opinions about what happened to her, about who was responsible, about whether she's still alive. It's a lot for kids to carry, and the family tries to shield them as much as possible. But they also want them to know the truth, to understand that their mother didn't leave them by choice, that she loved them more than anything, that what happened to her was not her fault, that her disappearance is not a reflection of her worth or her choices, but of violence perpetrated against her. These are heavy truths for children to absorb, but they're important, because the alternative, letting them believe that their mother abandoned them, is worse. So the family talks about Jermain often. They share memories. They look at photos and videos. They tell stories that make the boys laugh. They try to keep her alive in their hearts, even as her physical absence grows more permanent with each passing year. And they hope that someday, they'll be able to give the boys real answers. Not speculation, not theories, but the truth about what happened that night. Michael DeFrance still has custody of the boys. That's its own source of pain for Jermain's family. They've tried to maintain a relationship with their nephews and grandsons, but it's complicated. Michael controls access. He decides when and how often they can see the boys. And while he's never completely cut them off, the relationship is strained. Because how do you navigate that? How do you stay civil with someone you believe is responsible for your daughter's disappearance? How do you hand your grandsons back over to him at the end of a visit, knowing what you know, suspecting what you suspect? It's an impossible situation. But the family does it anyway. Because their relationship with Thomas and Jake matters more than their anger at Michael. Because cutting off contact would only hurt the boys. Because despite everything, they're trying to do what Jermain would have wanted, to stay in her sons' lives, to be a source of love and stability for them. It requires swallowing rage. It requires biting their tongues. It requires a kind of strength that shouldn't be necessary. But they do it. For the boys. For Jermain. There are moments when Valinda wonders if she's doing the right thing. If staying silent about her suspicions, at least around the boys, is protecting them or failing them. If maintaining civility with Michael is pragmatic or cowardly. If focusing on advocacy work is meaningful or just a way to avoid the unbearable reality that Jermain might never be found. She doesn't have answers to those questions. She's just doing the best she can. The same way everyone in the family is. One day at a time. One search at a time. One vigil at a time. 1 year at a time. In the broader context of MMIW cases, Jermain's story is both typical and exceptional. Typical in the pattern it follows: an Indigenous woman, a history of domestic violence, a disappearance, a stalled investigation. Exceptional in the amount of attention it's received. Most families of missing Indigenous women don't get national media coverage. They don't get documentaries made about their loved ones. They don't get to speak at symposiums in Washington, D.C. They search alone. They advocate alone. They grieve alone. The fact that Jermain's case has gotten as much attention as it has is due entirely to her family's tireless work. But it's also due to factors beyond their control: timing, the particular details of the case, The fact that it happened just as the MMIW movement was gaining national momentum. And even with all that attention, it hasn't been solved. Which raises a difficult question. If a case with this much visibility, this much evidence, this much public pressure, can't be solved, what hope is there for the hundreds of other cases that haven't received any attention at all? It's a question that haunts advocates. Because the truth is, most cases won't be solved. Most families won't get answers. Most missing women will remain missing. And that's not because law enforcement isn't trying. Though in some cases, they aren't trying hard enough. It's because the system is fundamentally broken. Because Indigenous communities have been marginalized for so long that the infrastructure to properly investigate these cases doesn't exist. Because jurisdictional boundaries create gaps that are nearly impossible to navigate. Because poverty, historical trauma, and ongoing discrimination create conditions where violence thrives and accountability is rare. Fixing that requires more than individual investigations. It requires systemic change, policy reform, resource allocation, cultural shifts in how Indigenous lives are valued. And those changes are happening, slowly, but not fast enough to save Jermain. Not fast enough to bring closure to her family. Not fast enough to prevent the next disappearance. So the work continues. The advocacy continues. The searching continues. Even when it feels futile. Even when it feels like nothing will ever change. Because giving up is not an option. Not when there are still women missing. Not when there are still families waiting for answers. Not when there's still a chance, however small, that justice might be served. Belinda has said that she'll search for Jermain until the day she dies. That she'll never stop fighting for answers. That she'll never accept that Jermain's case is unsolvable. It's a promise she made to her niece. And it's a promise she intends to keep. Even if it takes the rest of her life. Even if she never gets the closure she's searching for. Even if the call she's waiting for never comes. Because some promises can't be broken. Some loves are stronger than uncertainty. Some fights are worth fighting even when you know you might lose. And Jermain is worth all of it. Every sleepless night. Every dead-end lead. Every painful conversation. Every year that passes without answers. She's worth it. Because she was a person. A daughter, mother, granddaughter, friend. She had dreams and flaws and a future that was taken from her. And she deserves to be remembered. She deserves to be found. She deserves justice. And her family will not stop fighting until all three of those things happen. No matter how long it takes. There's a particular kind of cruelty in the phrase, moving on. People mean well when they say it. They're trying to be supportive, trying to encourage healing. But when someone is missing, moving on feels impossible. Because moving on implies closure. It implies acceptance. It implies that you've processed the loss and found a way to live with it. But how do you process a loss that hasn't been confirmed? How do you accept something when you don't know what you're accepting? How do you heal when the wound is still open, still bleeding, still fresh every single day? For Jermain's family, there is no moving on. There's only moving forward. And those are very different things. Moving forward means getting up every morning even when you don't want to. It means going to work, paying bills, taking care of responsibilities. It means finding moments of joy, birthdays, holidays, small victories, even while carrying the weight of not knowing. It means learning to live with two realities at once, the life you're living now and the ghost of the life that should have been. It's exhausting. It's like carrying a backpack full of stones that never gets lighter. Some days the weight is bearable. Other days it's crushing. But you keep walking anyway. Because what else can you do? The anniversaries are the hardest. June 16th, the day Jermain disappeared, has become a marker the family both dreads and needs. It's a day to remember, to recommit, to gather with others who care and refuse to let her be forgotten. But it's also a reminder of how much time has passed. 6 years, then 7. Each year that ticks by feels like a betrayal somehow, like by continuing to live, by finding moments of happiness, by laughing at jokes or enjoying a meal. They're somehow dishonoring Jermain's memory. It's not rational, but grief rarely is. Vicky, Jermain's grandmother, struggles with this particularly hard. She's in her 70s now, and the years of stress have taken a toll on her health. She's had heart problems, blood pressure issues, the kind of stress-related illnesses that come from carrying too much for too long. Her doctor has told her she needs to reduce stress. But how? How do you reduce stress when your granddaughter is missing? When every day brings the possibility of devastating news? When you've written a letter to her that might never be read, you can't. So Vicky continues to carry it. And she continues to pray. Faith is complicated in situations like this. Some people find it sustaining, a belief that God has a plan, that everything happens for a reason, that justice will prevail eventually. Others find it hollow. How could a loving God allow this to happen? How could there be a plan that involves a young mother disappearing without a trace? Vicky falls somewhere in between. She believes in God. She prays every day. She asks for strength, for answers, for Jermain to be found. But she also wrestles with anger, with the question of why. Why Jermain? Why their family? Why is there so much violence against Indigenous women? Why does the system fail them over and over? She doesn't have answers, but she keeps praying anyway. Because faith, for her, isn't about having all the answers. It's about holding on to hope when there's nothing else left to hold. The community on the Flathead Reservation has been both a source of support and a source of pain. On one hand, people have been incredibly generous. They've donated money for billboards and searches. They've volunteered their time. They've shown up for vigils and ceremonies. They've kept Jermain's name alive in conversations. But on the other hand, small communities can be cruel. Rumors spread quickly. Judgments are made. And sometimes, people who should be allies become sources of additional hurt. There have been whispers about Jermain's personal life, relationships she had, choices she made, struggles she faced. As if any of those things justify what happened to her. As if a person has to be perfect to deserve justice. It's victim blaming dressed up as concern. And it cuts deep every time. Because the implication is always the same. Maybe she put herself in this situation. Maybe she should have known better. Maybe she's somehow responsible for her own disappearance. It's the same narrative that's been used to dismiss violence against women for centuries. Especially violence against Indigenous women. The stereotype of the troubled Native woman, involved in drugs, in bad relationships, making poor choices. It's a narrative designed to absolve the system of responsibility. To suggest that these disappearances are inevitable consequences of individual behavior rather than symptoms of systemic violence. Jermain's family has fought against that narrative from day one. They've been open about her struggles, the difficult relationship with Michael, the custody battle, the financial pressures. But they've also been clear, none of those things made her expendable. None of those things meant she deserved what happened. And none of those things should disqualify her from a full, aggressive investigation. She was a human being. She was a mother. She mattered. And she deserves the same effort, the same resources, the same urgency that would be given to any other missing person. That's the message they've tried to convey at every opportunity. In interviews, at rallies, in testimonies before legislative committees. It's exhausting to have to constantly assert someone's humanity, to have to remind people that your loved one was worth caring about. But in a society that has historically devalued Indigenous lives, it's necessary. Because without that constant assertion, cases get forgotten. Files get buried. Women become statistics. And Jermain refuses to be just a statistic. Her family won't allow it. In recent years, there have been some technological advances that offer new possibilities for cold cases. Genealogical DNA databases have revolutionized the field. Cases that were cold for decades are being solved because investigators can now use DNA from crime scenes to identify suspects through their relatives. It's the same technology that was used to catch the Golden State Killer. And it's being applied to missing persons cases as well. The problem in Jermain's case is that there's no DNA to test. No crime scene. No physical evidence. Without a body, without Jermain's belongings, without anything concrete to analyze, the new technology doesn't help. It's maddening. Because the tools exist to solve cases, but only if you have evidence to work with. Still, the family holds out hope that someday, something will be found. A piece of clothing. A bone. Something, anything, that can be tested and analyzed and potentially traced. It's a terrible thing to hope for. To hope that your loved one's remains will be discovered. But it's also the only path to answers. The only way to confirm what everyone already suspects. The only way to potentially build a case against whoever is responsible. So they hope for it. Even as they dread it. Even as the thought of it breaks their hearts. Michael Difference's life has continued, apparently unburdened. He still lives in the area. He still has custody of Thomas and Jake. He still goes to work, sees friends, participates in community events. To an outside observer, He might look like a single father doing his best. Someone who experienced the tragedy of his ex-girlfriend disappearing and has had to move forward, raising their sons alone. It's a narrative that's easy to construct, and it's one that allows him to maintain a veneer of normalcy. But those who know the details, who know about the changing stories, the cell phone evidence, the refusal of the polygraph, see something different. They see someone who has gotten away with something. Someone who knows more than he's saying. Someone who has chosen silence over truth. And that's difficult to witness. Difficult to accept. Difficult to live with. Especially for Jermain's family, who have to see him at custody exchanges, at school events, at community gatherings. Who have to watch him live his life while their daughter is gone. There's no guidebook for that. No advice column that can tell you how to navigate those encounters. You just do it. With clenched fists and forced smiles. With all the strength you can muster. For the boys. Always for the boys. Thomas and Jake are 11 and 9 now. Old enough to remember fragments of their mother, though those memories are fading. Old enough to understand that what happened to her is unusual, tragic, unresolved. Old enough to have access to the internet, where they can read about their mother's case in detail. It's a difficult age. They're forming their identities, figuring out who they are, trying to make sense of their place in the world. And they're doing it without their mother. With a father who may or may not be responsible for her disappearance. In a community where everyone knows their family's story. Under the weight of public scrutiny and private grief. The family worries about them constantly. About how this trauma will shape them. About what they're being told at home versus what they hear elsewhere. About whether they'll grow up angry, confused, emotionally damaged by the uncertainty. There's no way to protect them from all of it. But the family tries. They make sure the boys know they're loved. That they have a support system beyond their father. That their mother's disappearance was not their fault and not something they need to carry shame about. They try to give them normalcy, birthday parties, fishing trips, homework help, all the ordinary things that make up a childhood. But underneath it all, there's the unspoken question that hangs over everything. What will happen when the boys are old enough to really understand? When they can read the case files, follow the evidence, draw their own conclusions. What will they think of their father? What will they think of the family that's been fighting for justice for their mother? How will they reconcile the two narratives? The father who's raised them, and the man who was the last person seen with their missing mother. It's a reckoning that's coming. Maybe not this year. Maybe not next. But someday. And when it does, it will bring its own kind of devastation. Because there's no good outcome. Either the boys will have to grapple with the possibility that their father was involved in their mother's disappearance. Or they'll have to accept that they'll never know what happened. Both options are traumatic. Both will leave scars. And there's nothing anyone can do to prevent it. The family can only be there when it happens. To offer support. To answer questions honestly. To help the boys navigate whatever truths they discover. It's all they can do. In the meantime, the investigation continues, at least nominally. The Missoula Police Department still lists Jermain's case as open. They still accept tips through their hotline. They still have a detective assigned, though how much active work is being done is unclear. The FBI is still technically involved, though their role has diminished over time. Without new leads, there's only so much investigating that can be done. You can only re-interview the same witnesses so many times. You can only re-examine the same evidence from so many angles. Eventually, you hit a wall. And unless something changes, unless someone comes forward, unless new evidence emerges, unless there's a technological breakthrough, the case will remain exactly where it is. Open but unsolved. Active but stagnant. A file that gets pulled out periodically, reviewed, and then put back on the shelf. It's not enough. But it's the reality. The family knows this. They've accepted it, in a way. Not that they're giving up, they'll never give up. But they understand the limitations. They understand that without someone talking, without physical evidence, the case may never be solved through traditional investigative means. So they've shifted their focus slightly. Instead of waiting for law enforcement to solve it, they're trying to create conditions that might force someone to talk. They keep Jermain's story in the public eye. They participate in media interviews. They speak at events. They use social media to reach new audiences. Because they believe that somewhere out there, someone knows something. Maybe it's someone who was told a secret years ago and has carried it since. Maybe it's someone who noticed something strange that night and never connected it to Jermain's disappearance. Maybe it's someone whose conscience has been eating at them and they just need the right moment, the right push, to come forward. The family is trying to create that moment, to keep the pressure on, to make it harder and harder for whoever knows the truth to stay silent. It's a long shot, but it's all they have. And so they persist. Year after year, story after story, vigil after vigil. They persist. Because Jermain deserves it. Because Thomas and Jake deserve it. Because every missing woman deserves a family that won't give up. And because somewhere, deep down, they still believe that the truth will eventually come out. That secrets are heavy. That guilt is corrosive. That silence, eventually, becomes unbearable. They've seen it happen in other cases. Years later, decades later, someone finally talks. A deathbed confession. A relationship that falls apart, and one person uses information as leverage. A new generation asking questions that previous generations refused to answer. It happens. And when it does, everything changes. Cases that seemed unsolvable suddenly have suspects, evidence, resolution. Families that have waited for years finally get answers. It's not common, but it's possible. And possibility is enough to sustain hope. So the family waits. And while they wait, they live. They raise Jermain's sons as best they can from a distance. They support other families going through similar nightmares. They advocate for policy changes that might prevent future disappearances. They honor Jermain's memory in ways both public and private. And they hold on to the belief that someday, maybe not today, maybe not this year, but someday, they'll get the call they've been waiting for. The one that changes everything. The one that brings Jermain home. There's a difference between being found and coming home. Being found is about location, coordinates, physical evidence, a place marked on a map. Coming home is about resolution, about being returned to the people who love you, about the end of waiting. Jermain's family understands this distinction now in ways they didn't at the beginning. In those first desperate weeks, they thought finding her was the goal. Bring her home. That's what they said. That's what they meant. But now, years later, they understand that even if she's found, she won't really come home. Not the way she left. Not as the vibrant young woman who posted selfies and made her sons laugh and dreamed of art school. If she's found, it will be remains. Evidence. Something to bury. And while that would be its own kind of closure, devastating but necessary, it's not the same as getting her back. She's already gone. The question now is just whether they'll ever know where. Whether they'll ever have somewhere to visit. Somewhere to lay flowers. Somewhere to bring her sons when they're ready. A grave instead of an absence. That's what they're hoping for now. It's a diminished hope. A realistic one. A hope that has learned to make peace with the worst outcome. But it's still hope. And sometimes, that's all you have. The public understanding of missing persons cases is often shaped by the ones that get solved. The dramatic breaks. The confessions. The remains found by a hiker or a construction crew. Those are the stories that make headlines. But they're not the norm. The norm is cases like Jermain's. Cases that go years without resolution. Cases where the evidence points in a certain direction, but isn't quite enough. Cases where everyone has theories, but no one has proof. Cases that slowly fade from public consciousness, remembered only by the families who can't forget. There are thousands of these cases across North America. Thousands of families waiting. Thousands of missing persons whose cases are technically open, but practically stalled. And for Indigenous families, the numbers are even worse. The National Crime Information Center reported over 5,700 missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls in 2016. The Department of Justice's own data shows that in some tribal communities, Indigenous women face murder rates that are 10 times the national average. These aren't just statistics. Each one represents a person, a family, a community fractured by loss. Jermain is one of thousands. But to her family, she's not a number. She's not a data point in a report. She's Jermain. Irreplaceable. Unforgettable. Worth every minute they've spent searching. Worth every tear they've cried. Worth every fight they've fought. And she always will be. The advocacy work that Jermain's family has done has had ripple effects beyond their own case. They've connected with other families. Shared resources. Offered guidance based on what they've learned. They've pushed for legislative changes in Montana. Better coordination between agencies, more resources for missing persons investigations, cultural competency training for law enforcement. Some of those changes have happened. In 2019, Montana passed House Bill 21, also known as Hannah's Act. It created a task force to study the issue of missing Indigenous persons and make recommendations. It was named after Hannah Harris, a young Northern Cheyenne woman who was murdered in 2013. Jermain's case was one of those cited in pushing for the legislation. The task force has done important work, identifying gaps in data collection, improving communication between agencies, raising awareness. But legislation and task forces don't bring missing women home. They don't solve cold cases. They create infrastructure for the future. They try to prevent the next disappearance. And that matters. But it doesn't help Jermain. Still, the family participates. Because if their pain can contribute to changes that protect someone else's daughter, someone else's mother, someone else's sister, then it means something. It doesn't erase the loss, but it gives it meaning. And sometimes, that's the best you can hope for when there's no justice to be had. In Indigenous communities, there's a tradition of naming, of speaking names aloud so that people are remembered, of refusing to let the dead, or the missing, fade into silence. Every year at MMIW events, names are read. Jermain Charlo, Hannah Harris, Ashley Loring Heavy Runner, Sarah Stops Pretty Places, Selena Not Afraid. The list goes on and on. Women and girls from tribes across Montana and across the country. Each name carries a story. Each name represents a family still waiting. Each name is an indictment of a system that has failed to protect Indigenous women. When Jermain's name is called, Valinda stands. She holds a photo of her niece. She refuses to let Jermain be reduced to a statistic. She makes sure everyone in the room sees her face, knows her name, understands that she was real. It's a small act, but it's important, because visibility matters. Memory matters. Refusing to let someone be forgotten matters. And as long as Jermain's family is alive, she won't be forgotten. Thomas and Jake are growing up in a world that's different from the one their mother knew. The MMIW movement has brought attention to issues that were ignored for generations. Indigenous voices are being heard in ways they weren't before. There's more awareness, more resources, more political will to address the crisis. It's not enough yet, but it's better than it was. And maybe, by the time Thomas and Jake have children of their own, the world will be a safer place for Indigenous women. Maybe their daughters won't face the same risks their mother did. Maybe the systems will work better, protect more effectively, respond more urgently. It's a hope worth holding on to, even if it feels impossibly far away right now. Even if the progress is slow and incremental and frustrating. Even if it can't help Jermain. Because you have to believe that things can get better. That all this pain, all this work, all this advocacy will eventually lead somewhere. That the arc of justice, however long, eventually bends toward truth. You have to believe it. Because the alternative, accepting that nothing will ever change, that women will keep disappearing, that families will keep suffering, that perpetrators will keep getting away with it, is unbearable. So you believe, and you fight, and you refuse to give up, even when it feels futile, especially when it feels futile, because that's when it matters most. There are moments when Valinda thinks about what she would say to Michael Difference if she had the chance. Not in anger, though there's plenty of that, but in honesty. What would she say if she could sit across from him and speak without interruption? She'd tell him that she knows, that the family knows, that the community knows, that the evidence speaks for itself. She'd tell him that the truth has a way of emerging eventually, that secrets are heavy, that guilt is corrosive, that silence doesn't actually protect you, it just delays the inevitable. She'd tell him about Thomas and Jake, about how they're growing up without their mother, about the questions they ask that no one can answer, about the hole in their lives that will never be filled. She'd tell him that if he has any conscience at all, if he has any love for his sons, he would give them the truth. Even if it means facing consequences. Even if it means admitting to something terrible. Even if it destroys his own life. Because his sons deserve to know what happened to their mother. They deserve closure. They deserve the chance to grieve properly instead of living in this terrible limbo. And Jermain deserves to be found. She deserves to be brought home. She deserves a burial. A headstone. A place where people can visit and remember her. She'd tell him all of that. And then she'd wait. To see if any of it landed. To see if any part of him felt moved to finally tell the truth. But she'll probably never get that chance. And even if she did, she doubts it would change anything. Because if 6 years of investigation, public pressure, and media attention haven't made him talk, a conversation with her probably won't either. Still, she thinks about it. Because it's human nature to want confrontation. To want the person you believe is responsible to look you in the eye and acknowledge what they've done. But the reality is, that moment may never come. And the family has to find a way to live with that. The thing about unresolved grief is that it doesn't follow a predictable pattern. You don't move through stages in a neat, orderly fashion. You cycle through them, sometimes multiple times a day. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Except acceptance never quite sticks. Because how do you accept something that isn't finished? So you loop back. You bargain again. You get angry again. You fall into despair again. And then you get up and keep going. Because what else can you do? For Jermain's family, some days are harder than others. Birthdays, holidays, the anniversary of her disappearance. But sometimes it's random days. A Tuesday in October when nothing special is happening, and suddenly the grief hits like a wave and you can barely breathe. You see something that reminds you of her, a song on the radio, a color she loved, someone who laughs like she did. And suddenly you're right back in it. The rawness, the disbelief, the desperate wish that this was all a nightmare you could wake up from. Those moments are the hardest. Because there's no trigger you can avoid. No way to prepare. Grief just ambushes you. And you have to ride it out. Let it wash over you. And then, when it recedes, pick yourself up and keep moving. Vicky still keeps Jermain's photo on her mantle. She talks to it sometimes. Tells Jermain about what's happening with the family. About how the boys are doing. About the advocacy work. She knows it's just a photo. She knows Jermain isn't there to hear her. But it helps anyway. It's a way of keeping the connection alive. Of refusing to let Jermain slip away completely. And in some small way, it eases the ache. Not much, but enough to keep going. As we reach the end of this story, or rather, this chapter, because the story isn't over, it's important to remember what this is really about. It's not about the mystery, though that's compelling. It's not about the investigation, though that's frustrating. It's not even about justice, though that's desperately needed. It's about a person, Jermain Austin Charlo. Born April 18, 1995. Last seen June 16, 2018. A woman who loved her sons more than anything. Who dreamed of being an artist. Who posted constantly on social media because she wanted to share her life. Who struggled sometimes, like everyone does. Who was loved by her family. Who mattered. Who still matters. That's what this is about. Not the sensational details, or the unanswered questions, or the speculation about what happened. It's about remembering that behind every missing person's case is a human being. Someone with hopes and fears and flaws and strengths. Someone who was taken from people who love them. Someone who deserves to be found. Jermain's case remains unsolved. The Missoula Police Department continues to maintain it as an open investigation. They still accept tips at 406-552-6300. The FBI can be reached at tips.fbi.gov. And Jermain's family is still searching, still advocating, still refusing to give up. They'll keep her name alive. They'll keep pushing for answers. They'll keep fighting for justice. For as long as it takes. Because that's what love requires. Not giving up. Not moving on. Not accepting the unacceptable. Just continuing to show up. Day after day. Year after year. Carrying the weight. Bearing witness. Refusing to forget. And hoping, always hoping, that someday, the truth will emerge. That someone will finally speak. That Jermain will be found. That her sons will get the answers they deserve. That her family will finally be able to bring her home. It might not happen. After 7 years, it's possible it never will. But they'll keep hoping anyway. Because hope, in cases like this, isn't about optimism. It's about love. And love doesn't give up. Not ever. So if you're listening to this, if you followed Jermain's story this far, here's what the family wants you to know. Someone out there knows what happened. Maybe you saw something that night in Missoula. Maybe someone told you something that didn't seem important at the time. Maybe you've been carrying a secret that's gotten heavier over the years. If that's you, please come forward. It's not too late. It's never too late. Jermain's family deserves answers. Her sons deserve to know what happened to their mother. And Jermain deserves to be found. If you know anything at all, please contact the Missoula Police Department or the FBI. You can remain anonymous. You can provide information without consequences. But please, don't stay silent. Because silence protects the guilty. And truth, however painful, is what brings healing. To Jermain's family, thank you for letting us tell her story. Thank you for your strength, your persistence, your refusal to let her be forgotten. To everyone listening, please share this story. Talk about it. Keep Jermain's name in circulation. Because visibility matters. Attention matters. And someone out there knows something. To Jermain, your family hasn't given up. They never will. And wherever you are loved. You are remembered. And you will be found. As long as Jermain Charlo is missing, this story is not over. And her family will not stop fighting until it is. If you found this story meaningful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who care about justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your theories, or simply to let Jermain's family know that you're thinking of them. Thank you for listening. And please, don't forget Jermain Charlo.